Hello and welcome or welcome back to Read Becca for my weekly chatty catch up on everything I've read, everything I'm currently reading, and everything I'm looking forward to reading for roughly the current week, and some general chit chat. So I think I'm finally out of the slump, having some good reading vibes, and feeling very, very good. So I also really enjoyed everything that I read this week. And it was all for People April. So first I read Life on Other Planets, a memoir of finding my place in the universe by Aomawa Shields. This was so good. This is a memoir, so it is very much sort of individual anecdotes. It feels pretty linear, and I tend to prefer more linear memoirs. But this was great. It is so engaging, and I think this is one of the more engaging memoirs that I have ever read. This was a stellar example. It's incredible how much she managed to incorporate and really focus other people than herself. Everything from her own grandmother, who was a lifelong math practitioner and a bit math obsessed, I would say. Even in a time when she couldn't make that her career, she was constantly striving. Famous figures that inspired her, people she was connected with elsewhere in her career or personal life. But yeah, she manages to center other people so much, so this feels like it goes beyond just simply memoir. And I love that. But it's also just a really good story in terms of her memoir. She is going through an experience where she ends up as this NASA scientist who's studying exoplanets, where her journey to get there was very random, I guess. It was really a winding path, certainly. She has parents who were creatives, certainly. As I mentioned, her grandmother was really into math, but her parents are musicians. And so she always had that sense of both STEM and creativity instilled in her, and you can see that throughout her journey in life. She went to school initially going toward that STEM career, and then because of all of the struggles facing her as a woman of color, as well as just simply a woman in academia, it really put her off, and she didn't feel the support and acceptance that she needed to progress in that area, and so she stepped away. She found other interests and developed those and wound up in this sort of career as a performer, very much a struggling actress. So we go through both struggles and successes in the story. And eventually, though she has found all of this joy in creativity purely through performance, she finds herself feeling that lack of the STEM side of herself in science and returns again to her career, her education, higher education, getting her PhD, tenure, those sort of things, really pursuing those scholarly elements of herself and finding her way into what is, I guess, the conjunction of those two things, where she is running a group for young women, particularly young women of color, to engage with combining the creative and the scientific. And I just love that she took that unique side of herself and used it to inspire and engage others. And so engaging is definitely the word for this, because I just found this something I connected with so hard, and her story was so compelling to read from start to finish. I did also read this on audio, and the audio is narrated by herself, and she did a fabulous job. Obviously, the acting plays into that, but she really is a great communicator, and at points she does bring up the idea that at times she has pursued being a science communicator in various realms, and I could totally see her pursuing that even further and gaining a lot of success in that area. So this was great. Next I read Scribbles, Sorrows, and Russet Leather Boots, The Life of Louisa May Alcott by Liz Rosenberg and illustrated by Diana Sudica. So I'll make sure to put in some of the illustrations. There are nice full-page illustrations on every chapter break. So this was a great book. I really enjoyed this, but it was also very hard reading. And I was a little surprised by that, I guess, because it was a middle grade, and it does not feel like a middle grade at all in terms of simplifying the writing, really, or simplifying the content. If anything, it has more content because it's for younger readers, in that the author is trying to provide historical context for things that a young person might not know about, them not having access to certain technologies, or just the way things were done at the time is very contextualized. But this was fantastic. I felt I knew quite a bit about Alcott's life, and she is obviously the author of Little Women, very famous for that, and I knew a lot of the aspects that she translated from her real life into Little Women. So I would say that was the bulk of the biography I had before, and this is much more comprehensive. It gives us such a broad picture of her life, and it does really focus in somewhat necessarily on her family life, mainly because her own writings and her diaries and letters focused in on that. Yet she was also part of a lot of really big things at the time. So her father was, I don't know if he was the leader or was just involved heavily in the Transcendentalists. And I actually have a book on my lengthy TBR list that I want to get to about the Transcendentalists, and this really pushed that up my list. She wrote about her family life, but was involved with that as a child, obviously a young child. Her father already was very deep into his grand plans for that, the Transcendental movement. But she and her family were potentially, I guess we have enough to presume, that they had a house that was part of the Underground Railroad. They were extremely pro-desegregation and ran a school as part of their transcendentalist plans that did desegregate and struggled and failed as a result because people thought that was too extreme. When the Civil War sprung out, she became a nurse, and only lamenting that she was not a man, so she couldn't go off to fight. And so she was at the forefront in so many areas as well. On top of that, of Civil War and all of these forward-thinking things, she was a suffragist and did get some right to vote before she died, which is also wonderful. And we don't hear about that as much, I don't think. I definitely don't think of Alcott when I think of suffrage, but she was on the forefront of so many progressive ideals of the time. And I think that the author did a wonderful job of towing the line in looking at how she and her family kind of got there, because a huge piece of it is to do with her father, Bronson Alcott. And the line that was being towed there is that he did have all these grand plans and amazing ideals for a utopian society that he wanted to see play out. And many of his ideas were great. He at times kept starting these schools, trying to spread a lot of this heady philosophical conversation with people, welcoming people in. They were always very giving and welcoming to people. But at the same time, he was very mentally ill. He was very impulsive, certainly, and caused a lot of problems for his family, as well as many of these things being overtly abusive of his family. And so I think the author does a great job of balancing those facts that yeah, he did great things, but also he was doing massive harm to his family. So he certainly, I think, was narcissistic. And I think with this grandiosity, we know via both general information about him and the things that his family had to say about him, he definitely had bouts of mania, if not other mental illness. And the result of that was that his impulsivity would cause him to lose everything for his family. They almost would go through periods of stability while he was gone, off on some tour doing salons or conversations around, and they would get to a place where they were subsisting, not thriving, but subsisting, and that was an improvement while he was gone. And then he would come back and just bring this intense chaos. A lot of what Louisa May would go through as part of kind of his discipline or his attempt to impart meekness was overtly abuse, emotional abuse, if not, it wasn't physical violence toward her, but it was incredibly deeply disturbing. Things that she was just expected to kind of give up everything of herself all of the time and never have anything good. And so when you see stories from Little Women, I can see all of the connections there, and things like them not having presents and having to give up their own Christmas dinner. All of that really, I guess, connects back to this because of the things that were imposed on them by their dad. And it really gives a great sense of the underlying background for what she was writing. This does get into her later life, and I found that so interesting because that was probably the thing I knew the least about, and incredibly difficult to read because while she was a nurse, she got sick. Many of the people were not just there because of injury. Many people were coming down with widespread sickness because they were being crammed together in terrible conditions. And she got sick with typhoid pneumonia. And the doctors all were dosing her with meds because they liked her, and she was being dosed with mercury. And so the end of her life is difficult to read because she's dealing with mercury poisoning and suffering horribly for it, and just trying to find any relief while also trying to meet all of these demands and set things up so that her family is taken care of, because she was a spinster her whole life, and everything of herself went toward taking care of her sisters and her parents, because she just desperately wanted them out of the situation she had existed in as a child. Even to the point she wrote Little Women specifically because her father was trying to sell a book, and they didn't want to publish his book without her also signing on, because it seemed like she at that point already had a little bit more clout than he did, and he was constantly looking for how he could get ahead, and often used her. And that's very heartbreaking to read. So there was so much there in the older life that she went through that I found more quiet, I guess. It has less of these sort of big moments, but I connected with a lot more, I think, in her older life. We also have a little bit of her love life, and that was interesting to me because of the fact I had no idea, or I knew that there were a lot of prominent authors of the time surrounding her family as a result of the Transcendentalist movement. But Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau lived on their property or with them at points, and Emerson was probably her first years-long crush. I had no idea about that, if not both of them. She had a almost disappeared couple weeks in Europe with a man, and then in the end of her life, it sounds like she lived with a woman, and certainly they were partners in some way that may have been platonic, as well as romantic. We don't know, but it is interesting to see her have what was a very loving and caring relationship with this woman that was a true partnership in the end of her life. And I wish we had more of that. It seems like we have a little bit through letters mainly and some diaries, but it feels like she didn't open up about this thing that she engaged with in her fictional writing so much, about the loves and lives with other people. Meanwhile, she stayed so focused on her family, her relatives. And yeah, I wish she had opened up more about her romantic life. So I think that is about all I have to say about this one, in fact. But after that, I watched the movie of Little Women as a tie into that, because of course. So I liked it, and specifically I am talking about the Greta Gerwig 2019 Little Women. It was good. It is not my favorite Little Women though, and I actually think that the four girls were fantastic. Marmee was fantastic. Aunt March, Meryl Streep was Aunt March, perfect, spot on. So I loved that area of the cast, really, really good. I also think that probably Florence Pugh was great as an actress, but did not fit as Amy at all. Had none of the Amy characteristics I expected. And I almost rage quit when Timothée Chalamet came on as Laurie. He's not Laurie. No, that was very disappointing. Yeah. But I did think the story was really well told. It's interesting that the way they laid it out, it kind of enters at the middle and then tells two separate timelines from there. And I think that was really well laid out and kind of an interesting way of handling, I guess, the storytelling. So I thought it was a good movie. I did really like it as the movie, but it was not the Little Women for me. And certainly Christian Bale will always be my Laurie. So that is that for Alcott. On to the last thing I read this week, and that was In Limbo by Deb J.J. Lee. So accidentally, I managed to pick up and have on my shelf 2 graphic memoirs about the Korean American experience and not put together that I had done that. So last week I read Almost American Girl, and this week I had In Limbo, and they both tell very similar stories, so it felt really in conversation with each other to me. That was so interesting. This one I think was much better laid out for my liking. And I also really love the art in this. The art style is really different from anything I have seen, other than maybe Brian Selznick is kind of similar, but very different still. So this is from the perspective of Deb. This is someone who has been completely steeped in American culture growing up, but still feels like an outsider. And also there's some mental health issues discussed as a result of all of those pressures and struggles that they go through. So I really liked that aspect, and appropriately, because I crossed the April-May sort of timeline reading this. It counts for both people April and mental health May, I think, as a result. So I think there was just so much in conversation here with Almost American Girl, because we have a lot of questioning about those social and cultural pressures on both sides. So Deb is going through even a simple element that came up in both is the Korean pressure for plastic surgery. We're seeing Deb process that in a way of not being sure about surgery. Is it just social pressure? Social pressure on the American side to have American eyes, or Korean pressure on the side of just simply getting plastic surgery because it's the thing to do when you're in your late teens and you're able to start doing that. You just get plastic surgery. And so there's this very intense feeling of that pressure on both directions. And so I really empathized with that. There's also this feeling of outsiderness in both directions as well, because obviously there's the bullying culturally in the US, but when Deb travels to Korea, even with family, there's a disconnect there. And so you feel that separation from having a place. In both in Limbo and Almost American Girl, we have this wonderful turn of finding belonging and acceptance through art. And I love that. I love the empathy that's shown there, but the difficulty to get there. Here we have Deb, who is struggling with kind of the usual Asian parent standards of like academic excellence being pushed so hard and not being able to live up to it, being pushed toward music as a very serious pursuit, and again, not living up to expectations, or not being the best, and that just not being good enough. And finally, Deb gives up and pushes back and decides to pursue art. And the parents go along with it, thankfully, a bit. And Deb has the opportunity to go to kind of almost a summer art school. And that is where there's this connection, amazing connection and feeling of finally fitting. And yeah, I just loved that as a jumping off point into these things that you're going through are not forever, and you can work through it. However, I will say some of the darkest moments mental health wise are after that point, and this does have some pretty major trigger warnings. Though nothing is graphic here, there certainly are some heavy mental health conversations about this book. And I think those were handled very well. In fact, I really like the depiction of going to therapy and keeping it focused on Deb as a character. The therapist always is obscured with these big plant fronds. And I think that's a really cool way of showing that, of keeping it very much about Deb and centered on this being the experience that Deb is going through, rather than this making it this other person really interacting with Deb. So I think as both a memoir and as a discussion of mental health, I think this was pretty solid, as well as incorporating all of those experiences of being Korean American and the not feeling that you fit in either place, that really I think can give us a lot of empathy for this experience. And this is specifically a YA graphic memoir, and I think it was done in a very age-appropriate way without being simplified, much like my previous book. So that is everything that I read this week. So on reading, I'm just continuing on with City in the Middle of the Night by Charlie Jane Anders, as well as my Booktube prize books. So my reading is very much going well. I have been really churning away at books. That's fabulous. Life-wise, this week, well, let's say watching. I didn't watch anything, or I didn't finish anything. I usually wait till I finish stuff, other than Little Women. So that was my one finish for the week. And more generally, like, everything is really good. So I'm not complaining, but work was wild and very much dominated my time this week. And also, the allergies are trying to kill me right now. I'm really struggling. I think probably this is the worst allergies I've ever had since I've lived here. However, other than those things, I'm not complaining because I actually think I am right now in the best spot that I have been so far this year, from like mental health, physical health, emotionally. Like, I'm feeling really great right now. So if we can just stay here, reach stasis, I hope, I would be very happy. And I'm hoping that bodes well for a great reading month in May. And I think that's it for me today. My recommendations for the week, as always, I will link them down below in the description box. I have some kind of random ones this week, just because I was feeling it. So the first one is mainly because I talked a couple weeks ago about Resident Alien, and everyone was mentioning how much they love Wash from Firefly, because Alan Tudyk is the star. And naturally, of course, perfect timing, a video popped up from Variety, I think, of Alan doing this rapid fire kind of thing where they gave him lines from his previous roles and he had to name the characters. But of course, it's a whole funny dialogue of him discussing these different roles. And I loved it. It was so great, so funny, really fantastic. So I'm going to link that one. And then another kind of more pop culture-y thing than I usually provide as recommendations, but is very bookish. Jon Stewart has returned to The Daily Show, if you don't know. Not full-time, I think he's trading off, but it has been really fantastic this year with him back, and also they have been interviewing a lot of authors. So Jon did an interview with Salman Rushdie discussing his recent experience with the attempted assassination, and specifically discussing a bit of his book, Knife, about that experience. And it was a phenomenal interview. I really, really enjoyed it. So I highly recommend you check out that discussion between Jon and Salman. And then lastly, an actual booktube video. Usually that's more what I'm recommending. But the booktube video I'm going to recommend is actually a not quite bookish one. It's bookish inspired or tangential. And that is from Bar Cart Bookshelf, who I think I have mentioned before, but if not, very, very underrated channel who does single book reviews paired with a drink. And this is one that has been long awaited. We finally got the video for the Pan-Galactic Gargle Blaster. So you absolutely must check out that video. Definitely go check out Bar Cart Bookshelf. So I think that is it for me today. I hope you are having a wonderful reading week, and thank you so much for watching.